Welcome to the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists. I'm Mike Friedman, immediate past president of the National Press Club. I'm the former general manager of CBS Radio Network, now journalist in residence at University of Maryland Global Campus, and executive producer of the Kalb Report public broadcasting series, moderated by journalist Marvin Kalb. We thank you for joining us today for our virtual headliners program with author Fred Fromer and legendary local sports announcer and attorney Phil Hochberg. We're pleased to accept questions from our journalists tuning in today. I'll ask as many as time permits. To submit a question, please email headliners@press.org. One of my favorite books growing up was a novel by Douglas Wallop entitled The Year the Yankees Lost the Pennant, about a die-hard Washington baseball fan who sells his soul to the devil in order to return to his youth and propel his beloved but dreadful Washington Senators to an American League pennant. The book was turned into a hugely successful Broadway play called Damn Yankees, which won 7 Tony Awards in 1956, including Best Musical. A memorable song from that play has become a second national anthem for baseball fans and underdogs everywhere. It's called You Gotta Have Heart. And that is the title of the newest version of a book on the history of Washington baseball by Fred Fromer, a former Associated Press reporter who now heads the sports business practice of the Dewey Square Group in Washington, D.C. One of the key contributors to the book is distinguished Washington, D.C. sports and media attorney Phil Hochberg, who was also the first baseball and last football stadium announcer in the history of RFK Stadium. For 6 of those years in the 1960s, he announced Washington Senators games. And for his decades of service announcing pro baseball and football, as well as college sports games throughout the region, Phil Hochberg is a member of the Washington, D.C. Sports Hall of Fame. Gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Great to be here.
We originally planned to gather this afternoon as our present-day Washington Nationals were prepping for tonight's 2021 season opener with fans in the stands for the first time since October 2019. Yet shortly before airtime, we received word that the game has been postponed due to player and staff exposure to COVID. Gentlemen, this is a reality check reminder that we're not out of the global pandemic woods yet. And the current history of the Washington Nationals, and all of baseball for that matter, is still being written in a most unusual manner. So if ever there was a time to relax with a good book, tonight is the night, and this would be a perfect book. Fred, with 2 franchises having left town for other cities and a 33-year wait between the exit of the second Senators team and the arrival of the Washington Nationals, could there possibly be a better title than You Gotta Have Heart? Have any fans, in your opinion, in the country been through more than those here in the nation's capital in the history of this game?
I don't think so. And in fact, I argued in a 2016 piece for the Washington Post, as the Cubs were marching to what would become their first World Series title since 1908, that Washington baseball fans were deserving of more sympathy even than Cubs fans. And it's true that Cubs fans had to wait longer. You know, their World Series drought, as I mentioned, back to 1908, ours is 1924. But when you factor in that we hadn't had a team for those 33 years, and when we did have a team, it was so bad for so long. There was a quarter century in the middle of the 20th century where we had 2 winning franchises, 2 winning seasons the whole time. So I would argue that nobody had it worse than Washington baseball fans. Now we're finally over the hump, as are the Cubs, and hopefully we'll have a great new chapter being written by the Nationals in this century.
And Phil, you lived a lot of this history. Talk about the uniqueness of being a Washington baseball fan.
Well, Mike, I recall as you were going through the history and Fred's description that when the expansion Senators left in 1971, it was as if someone in my family had died. The powerlessness of having something taken away from me, and there was nothing that I could do about it. And then, of course, 33 years but it was wonderful, wonderful when the Lerners bought the club and brought the club to Washington. I don't have any sympathy, if you will, for the Montreal fans who lost a club. We went through it twice.
On the night of October 30th, 2019, with a 3-2 count in the bottom of the ninth, Daniel Hudson struck out Houston's Michael Brantley to clinch the World Series championship and complete an absolutely thrilling, heart-stopping 7-game series. The Nationals' improbable October run brought Washington its first championship since 1924. I'd love to hear you each talk about the similarities between those two championship teams, 1924 and 2019. Fred, you want to start?
Yeah, and it's a great question. There were a lot of striking similarities between the World Series of both of those teams. They were both going up against these gauntlets that had really dominated the respective other league. And in the Senators' case, it was the New York Giants in the National League, and of course, it was the Astros with the Washington Nationals. And both the Senators and the Nationals were big underdogs. In addition, they both came back from a late lead in the 7th game of the World Series, a multi-run lead that only 5 teams had ever come back from, and 2 of those teams are the Senators and the Nationals. They also seem to capture that spirit that the Washington Senators had. You know, in 24, fans were really excited, not just in Washington but across the country, for the Senators to finally break through. Partly because they'd never won a World Series, partly because New York City had dominated the sport. They had been, the previous World Series had been New York Giants versus New York Yankees, but mostly because Walter Johnson, at the age of 36, had never been to the World Series, and fans were pulling for him. And he didn't have quite that national pull, I don't think, for the Nationals, but we did see, I think, once they got to the playoffs, teams, you know, even had, there was a Dodgers pitcher after the Dodgers got eliminated by the Nats, said, now I'm pulling for the Nats. Fans and other sports writers would talk about the fact that once their team was gone, they wanted the Nationals to win. It was Washington's turn. So you had that same kind of sort of sentimental appeal of both teams across the country.
For me, it was wonderful that a few days later, I ran into a fellow I didn't even know, a waiter in a restaurant. And I told him that I had a long history with Washington baseball. And he said, "Did you cry when they won the World Series?" I said, "No, I cried when they beat Milwaukee to move into the second round of the playoffs." It was not sobs, but it was something that I had looked forward to. I started following baseball in 1948. And I had nothing to show for it.
No, that was quite a moment against Milwaukee, and of course for fans, I think they'll never forget that. I remember turning to my wife when the ball got past the outfielder in the 8th inning, and I said, "Oh my God, 3 runs are going to score. We're going to take the lead. We're going to take the lead," and I got chills as soon as you mentioned that again. So there were so many wonderful moments.
And Mike, you know, that ball that squirted past the right fielder took kind of a funny hop, and that's another echo from the 24 World Series. The Senators tied the 7th game of the World Series on a ground ball that hit a pebble or had some kind of bad hop. We don't have any real good video for back then. Went over the third baseman's head, and then the same thing happened in extra innings when the Senators won the game, another bad ball that got past the third baseman. So I had the same thought, and not the only one. I think Tom Boswell made the same observation, that this is something that, you know, if you don't believe in ghosts, sometimes baseball will make you believe in ghosts.
Absolutely. So a lot of fans are aware that Washington has won a grand total of 2 world championships, 1924 and 2019. Fred, in addition to those milestones, as you researched and wrote, and as the original book and the new editions took shape, are there certain things that began to stand out in your mind as other most significant events in Washington baseball history?
Yeah, 1933. So they won two more pennants. I should back up a second. In 1925, they repeated as World Series, American League pennant winners, and then they lost the World Series in a kind of a grueling loss to the Pirates. But the 1933 team, that's the last pennant that Washington had won until 2019. And it may have been the best Washington baseball team ever. They had definitely the best winning percentage. They were this gauntlet. They had this young, dashing player manager named Joe Cronin, who was an incredible hitter, incredible fielder, great leader, very ferocious, would go toe-to-toe with tough players. Unfortunately, they lost the World Series to the Giants that year. And a year later, they sold Joe Cronin off to the Red Sox for $250,000 and a marginal player in return. And that really signaled, you were asking about milestones, that kind of signaled the end of competitive Washington baseball. After that, they only really had one competitive real pennant race. And that was in 1945 when most of the best players were overseas. And so you had this kind of ragtag team of players, including one guy who pitched in one game only. He had a missing leg, and he had an artificial leg that got him through the baseball game. His name was Bert Shepard. He pitched 5 1/3 innings in relief, and that's his only game. So he retires with a 1.69 ERA. You had a half-deaf outfielder. You had all these interesting characters, and they weren't eliminated until the final day of the season. So 33, 45, those are the moments that stick out for me.
You know, it's
Well,
interesting.
for me,
Go ahead, Phil.
I started following baseball in 1948, and until the club left in after 71, after 1970. I'm losing my train of thought. After 1960, they had one winning season in the last 15 years that the original Senators played here. One winning season. And of course, the expansion club continued that tradition by not having a winning season until 1969. So rooting for Washington baseball was difficult.
I'll just mention
Richard
personally.
Nixon actually said many years after both Nixon and the Senators left Washington, he was at some gala reception out in California, and he said, you had to have been a real baseball fan to root for the Washington Senators. It wasn't an easy lift. So, and as Phil could attest to by personal experience.
And I was just going to mention from personal experience that so much is about perspective and where you grew up geographically, because history tells me as a Detroiter that in 1945, the Tigers won the pennant on the last day of the season when Hank Greenberg returned from World War II and hit a grand slam on the last day of the season to win the pennant.
Right.
For the Tigers. Phil Hochberg, your career, I was thinking about this morning, and the analogy I came up with was your career has been like the Maltese Falcon, described by Humphrey Bogart as the stuff dreams are made of. I've known attorneys who have wanted nothing more than to be baseball announcers. I've known doctors and reporters who just wanted to be magicians. You've managed to do it all. Talk about the trajectory of your career and how you managed to combine the law and the microphone.
First of all, Mike, it ain't brain science. That show up, have the lineups in front of you, make sure that you check the pronunciations. There's nothing that tips off a fan that they've got an amateur doing the PA announcing when he mispronounces the particular ball player's name, like Hoot Evers, right? Not Hoot Evers, Hoot Evers. And so while I was in law school, I was doing the PA announcing. It was a great part-time job. In 1971, I wrote an article for the Sporting News on cable television and sports. And it was the first article on cable and sports in a national publication. And as a result of having that published, I got a call from the Philadelphia 76ers, and they said, we're involved in negotiations with a guy named Chuck Dolan with a brand new company called Home Box Office. And would you be willing to work with our lawyer, Louis Nizer, the famed Louis Nizer? And it took me about a millisecond to say, well, yeah, I think I can arrange that. But as a result of that article, I was asked to participate in a seminar at Brookings, and as fate would have it, sitting next to the secretary of the National Hockey League, showed him the article, wrote him the letter that the young lawyers write saying, wonderful to meet you. And I got a call from Clarence Campbell, the president of the National Hockey League. Would I come up to New York and address his board of governors on cable television? Well, you know the definition of an expert. That's a guy from out of town with a briefcase. That I was the expert because I had written the one article that people had seen. And I have now been representing the National Hockey League for just over 50 years, which is a pretty good run with a client.
That's very good. Well, it is truly a legendary career that you continue to have, and just terrific. Thank you for sharing that. We have some questions from some National Press Club members, and I'd like to start with a couple of questions from former National Press Club President Jonathan Salant, who Fred knows because he played baseball for softball for Jonathan on the Associated Press team, right?
Right.
At one time. And again, I'd like both of you to field these questions. And this is a serious, tricky question. How do you resolve the dispute with the Baltimore Orioles ownership over Masson, the Mid-Atlantic Sports Network? Thoughts on that? Fred, you want to take a whack at that?
Sure. I think Phil, as a lawyer, probably has more expertise. I would just say, as a fan, it just seems to me to be such a structurally problematic arrangement that they have. Just a little background for fans who don't know it is Peter Angelos, the Orioles owner, had fought tooth and nail Washington getting a team because he claimed it as part of his territory. If I could even go back a few decades, when the St. Louis Browns, more than a few decades, when the St. Louis Browns moved to Baltimore in the mid-50s, Washington had territorial rights over Baltimore, but Clark Griffith waived those rights. I believe he got some money in the deal, but not anything close to what Angelos was received. When the Senators moved, the Orioles were one of two teams that voted not to let them move. And what Bowie Kuhn, the commissioner, told me at the time was they only did that for show. They wanted the territory to themselves. They just didn't want to offend Senators fans. So when Washington finally gets a team again, when the Expos moved here in 2005, to mollify Peter Angelos, they set up this Mid-Atlantic Sports Network. And the Orioles have a controlling interest. I believe it reduces over time, but they continue to have a controlling interest. And then they have to pay the Nationals for the rights to broadcast their games, and they've been fighting over this for years. And every time baseball makes some kind of ruling, even if it's approved by a judge, the Orioles continue to fight it. I don't really know the answer. I've kind of gone on a little bit here. I don't know the answer, only to say that I guess the answer would be to just tear this thing up at some point, give Angelos whatever money he needs to get to make him whole, and let the Nationals have their own broadcast network like every other team has.
Phil, how do you see this?
I for one, would go along with that. We're talking tens of millions of dollars, and there have been a number of attempts to settle it. There have been a number of decisions which have been appealed. The Orioles are being, well, in my mind, as a Nationals fan, are being intransigent. But they have the legal right to do what they're doing. It remains to be seen what the end result, what do I want to say, the end objective of the Orioles is, but we know one short-term objective is not to pay the Nationals the money that baseball has said the Nationals are owed.
Here's another question from Jonathan Salant, and it's a big, broad one about baseball. If you could, what would you change about Major League Baseball today? And Phil, let me toss that to you first.
I, for one, would do away with the designated hitter and have pitchers bat in the American League. I think I'm in a distinct minority, and certainly from what we hear, it ain't going to happen. And the DH will be accepted by the National League. Beyond that, there are certain aspects of the playing rules which Major League Baseball is addressing now in minor league experiments. Should you have all 4 infielders playing on the dirt? Should you require all that 2 infielders be on one side of second base and 2 infielders be on the other? It's frustrating. It's frustrating when you see a guy hit a ball into right field and he's thrown out by the short fielder in right field who can get the ball to first before the batter. Look, it's legal under the rules, but rules can be changed.
A lot of us first saw that when Bryce Harper was totally stymied while a young Washington Nationals player. Fred, let's go.
You also remember, Mike, that this goes back to the late 40s when the Cleveland Indians did it to Ted Williams. Williams, probably a little more talented than most of the players playing now, would attempt to overcome it by hitting it where they ain't. He wouldn't hit the ball to left field where he had a much greater, I should say, to the left side of the infield, which he had a much greater chance of getting a base hit. But he was going to prove that he could overcome the Williams shift.
Right. If anybody could beat the shift, it would have been Ted Williams. Fred, your thoughts on changes that you might like to see in baseball?
Yeah, so I consider myself a baseball purist, and for that reason, I also would love to see the DH jettisoned. But having said that, I would like to see some radical changes because the game is just too slow now. When I was a kid, a typical game would go 2.5 hours, and now they're almost always 3 hours. In the playoffs, they tend to be 4 hours. It's just interminable. I would have a pitch clock. I would ban batters from stepping out of the box, barring some, bee flying in their eye or something. I'd also ban the shift. And I actually kind of like the shift initially because I thought it was interesting to watch these different configurations. But Phil's right. I mean, you get these balls that they go to die in short right, like it's a softball defense. And it's also made everybody, all the hitters, like obsessed with launch angles to overcome that. And it's fed into more strikeouts and to more swinging for the fences, all the things that I think make baseball boring. They call it the 3 true outcomes, strikeout, a walk, or a home run. And now I like triples. I like stolen bases. That's why I like what baseball's doing with the idea of making the bases a little bit bigger, maybe requiring left-handed relievers to step off the rubber if they want to try a pickoff attempt. Anything that would encourage stolen bases, because I can't stand the current obsession with, statistically, it doesn't make sense to steal bases, so we're never going to steal bases. And I think that's one of the most exciting parts of baseball. I'd love to see it there'd be more incentives for guys to try to steal bases and to try to doubles and triples.
Each of those is being experimented with in the minor leagues this year.
Let me follow up on Jonathan's question with one of the other changes that has been imposed, and that is starting off extra innings with a runner on second base. What?
Hate it. Hate it.
Phil?
You know what? I would rather see baseball bring back ties, which they had for much of the 20th century, mostly because of darkness and they didn't have lights back then. I'd rather say if the game goes 11 innings, we'll just call it a tie than have this fakakta thing with the guy on second base. I absolutely hate it.
As one who did the PA announcing on a 22-inning game, which the Senators won in the bottom of the 22nd in 1968. I for one, would prefer to see them play until the end, not a tie, and certainly not start off with the runner on second. How does he get there? How do you score that? You score him scoring a run without having that back? Pinch runner?
It's like an existential crisis, right? I mean, how do you explain it? You're right.
Right. Well, we have a very thoughtful question from one of our viewers this afternoon. 50 years ago next week, April 5th, 1971, Curt Flood started in center field on opening day for the Washington Senators. The St. Louis Cardinals great courageously challenged the reserve clause all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and lost, but lit a fire that led to free agency. His partner in those proceedings, MLB-PA Executive Director Marvin Miller, the Players Association Executive Director, is now in the Hall of Fame. Should Curt Flood be invited to join him? The Golden Days Committee, which covers 1950 to 69, is going to vote on such things in December of 2021. Fred, let me start with you and ask both of you, gentlemen, what you think about Curt Flood being elected through this means into the Hall of Fame for what he did in his career.
Yes, absolutely. He belongs in the Hall of Fame. You can make a case on his playing stats alone, his playing ability that he belonged. It's a kind of borderline case. He was a fantastic fielder, won tons of Gold Gloves. It was a great ball player, but certainly because of his leadership. And as the question points out, although he lost the Supreme Court case, it did lit a fire. And it's sad. He's pointed out that he had his case, I think, in 71, if I'm not mistaken, and the Cardinals were in town. I believe the Cardinals were in, I think it was not a Supreme Court case. It was a district court case, federal district court case in New York, and the Cardinals happened to be in town, his former teammates, and I believe only Bob Gibson came to show support. None of the other teammates did. Maybe one other. He was disappointed by that. But bottom line, he definitely belongs in the Hall of Fame for what he's done for players' rights.
I'm not necessarily going to agree with that, Fred. I think that you, as a St. Louis Cardinals fan, may be a little too prejudiced. What is interesting is the history of Marvin Miller and the Hall of Fame. He will be inducted this year. He was part of last year's class, but they didn't have the induction in 2020 because of the COVID crisis. And they will have the induction this year. Miller had said he did not, as frustrated as he was, he said he did not want to go into the Hall of Fame, yet they voted him in. Will his family attend? That's a significant question. Miller himself, because of his contributions to baseball, definitely belongs in the Hall of Fame. And in fact, I had asked Bud Selig that very question. Does Marvin Miller belong in the Hall of Fame? And Selig said, absolutely. And Selig was Miller's opponent for so many years. As to whether Flood goes in, I have reservations. I think he's...
Was that a pun, Phil? The reserve clause?
Is that what?
I said, was that a pun?
Reservation. Fred, you're too quick for me. But I do have reservations about Curt Flood going in. It's interesting. His appearance in center field 50 years ago, next week, was an effort by Bob Short, who owned the club at that time. Short found Flood in, I think, Spain, where he had gone after he left the major leagues. And it was a PR effort by Bob Short, one of his many PR efforts. And Flood stayed with the club for only a few games in 1971 when he finally retired.
Okay, thank you both. And a number of names have come up over the course of our conversation so far, and I just want to let you know and let the viewers know that in a few minutes we're going to go through a lightning round where I would like to toss some names and some events to you to take a swing at them, and we're going to cover a lot of ground in that as we come back to some of the names you've already mentioned. And let each of you talk about them. We have some questions now from a sportscaster friend with whom I worked at United Press International some years ago, Bob Berger, who's now based in Atlanta. What kind of relationship did the Senators fans have with the team? Was it like Brooklyn and the Dodgers, or was it something less emotional than that? Fred, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, Phil can talk to this from personal experience, but I see him shaking his head, and I would say it wasn't nearly the depth of the Dodgers and Giants from what I know. I would say in the 20s and 30s that this really was a crazy baseball town. The city fell in love with that team that had produced 3 pennants over a 10-year period. They had dethroned not only the New York Yankees, which was no easy feat with Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, and the like, but also took down the Giants in the World Series. They were seen as I mentioned earlier, as maybe I didn't mention this, the dashing young team that really was very attractive to folks. In fact, I mentioned Joe Cronin earlier, the manager of the pennant-winning team in '33. After they clinched that pennant, Joe Cronin had to run for his life as fans. This is how the Washington Post described it. Fans from both sexes besieged upon him madly, trying to tear at him. They were just so enthralled. He had to run into the dugout through the clubhouse. He then found himself cornered and wound up coming back on the field, running across center field through the center field doors, and got in a car and got out of there. He was beloved, and I think the team was. But, as I said, he was sold off about a year later. And the years and years of bad baseball and just not really putting any money to the team, I think, soured a lot of fans. So you didn't really have good attendance after that. And so there wasn't that love affair that you had in the 20s and 30s. And certainly you didn't have love affair that you had in Brooklyn and in Manhattan in the 1950s.
Too many years of bad baseball had its effect on the Washington fans. They didn't come out. I remember when I was doing the stadium announcing in the 60s, if the club would draw 10,000, that was a good night. Draw 10,000. But it was simply a question of too many years of too bad baseball. And certainly the love affair that the Brooklyn Dodgers had with the fans. It's that old Doris Kearns line about Hitler, Stalin, and Walter O'Malley are in a room, and you're in there. You've got a gun with 2 bullets in it. Who would you shoot? And the answer is, I'd shoot O'Malley twice. It wasn't that way here in Washington.
Here's another question from Bob Berger. Did Mickey Mantle really hit a 565-foot home run out of Griffith Stadium, or is that more of a tale? Fred?
Well, I'll take that one on.
Yeah, go ahead, Phil. Yeah.
Jane Levy, in her book on the Mick, explores this. She says that she found the man who who found the ball. The idea of 565 feet was a PR effort by the Yankees staff. He certainly hit the ball out of the stadium. the ball caromed off the Mr. Bo sign above left field and landed somewhere in the yards of the homes immediately behind left field. I'm not aware that anyone else had ever hit a ball out of Griffith Stadium on the left hand, over the left field bleachers. Doby once hit a ball over the center field fence, which probably was about the same length as Mantle's. But the Mantle home run shot was an effort by the Yankees PR staff to establish that that length of the 565-foot home run.
Fred, anything to add to that?
The only thing I would add is, Phil, if I'm not mistaken, isn't that where the term tape measure home run came from? Was it that time when the Yankees pulled out the tape? Okay, yeah. That's all I got.
That's great. Well, the Tops chewing gum company certainly promoted that myth, because I remember as a kid having a Tops card that showed the trajectory of the home run. Mantle hits 565-foot homer. Right. Okay, here's a question of mine, which I wrestle with, and it is, who should own the records of the previous Washington teams? Since Minnesota has the records of the original Senators, and the Texas Rangers have the records of the expansion Senators, while the current Nationals own the records of the Montreal Expos. Who should own the records of the previous Washington teams? Does baseball have it right, or should it be changed? Fred, you want to take that first?
Sure. I know how Phil feels about this. He's been very passionate on this topic. He doesn't want anything to do with the Expos. I understand that. I think you can kind of do it both ways. I mean, the way I look at it is, there are Montreal/Washington Nationals records, and you can look at it that way. But there are also, it's important in my mind as a Washington baseball guy to look at Washington baseball records, and you do see that as well. So if you're watching a telecast, for example, you may see them talk about, in the history of the franchise, go dating back to '69 in Montreal, that this is this record has been broken. But then you'll also see them talk about, the longest hitting streak of any Washington baseball player. And I think you can slice and dice it both ways. So I don't mind saying it both ways, but I know Phil feels a little differently.
Indeed. The records belong to the fans here. I've said the Lerners own the team, but the fans actually own the team instead of the Lerners. And as bad as the attendance records may have been over the years, as a native Washingtonian and as a longtime Washington baseball fan, I'm all for the local fans.
It's inconceivable that Walter Johnson could ever be listed as the greatest pitcher in the history of the Minnesota Twins.
Right. Yeah.
When you think about that. So, Phil, you talked before about the many losing seasons and how it perhaps tamped down a prolonged love affair between the fans and the original or an expansion Washington baseball teams. Could I ask the two of you to compare and contrast that with Washington now as a baseball town? How different is it now than before? Fred?
It's night and day. Washington was, for much of the 20th century, a small southern city. It's kind of a sleepy city almost. Didn't have anywhere near the population and the wealth and the business infrastructure that really supports the economy here in Washington now. So, I think that there was a misperception among Major League Baseball after the second Senators team had left that DC could never support a team. It was like kind of two strikes, you're out. And they kind of, when there was talk about a new team in the 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way through, I think a lot of owners had this perception in their mind of baseball in Washington, or Washington as it existed in 1971. We're nothing close to that city anymore, and I was glad they finally came to their senses, in 2004 when they moved the team here for the 2005 season. But they only did it because they had no choice. They really had nowhere else to send the Expos. But I think they've learned that, unfortunately, they're probably happy to learn that this city is a really good sports town and a good baseball town, much more so than it had been.
I'll agree wholeheartedly with Fred on that.
So let's talk about a couple of key games. Love to get your thoughts on it, both from an historical vantage point in your research, Fred, and as someone who was around and very much involved in Washington sports at the time. Talk about that last Senators game in 1971.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Senators' final game was against the Yankees, which was sort of fitting because, as we talked earlier, the Yankees play into the whole sort of myth and the literature of baseball in Washington. So they take on the Yankees. The fans are in a rowdy mood. They have all kinds of signs criticizing Bob Short, the owner who had announced he was moving the team to Texas after the season. And the Senators had, if I'm not mistaken, a 7-5 lead in the ninth inning with 2 outs, and the fans just stormed the field. Actually, a couple of innings earlier, a few fans stormed the field, and an announcement was made warning them that if they did it again, the game could go down as a forfeit. But by the ninth inning, there's all this pent-up aggression, and they all stormed the field. And so that last game, instead of a 7-5 victory, which would have been nice, goes down as a 9-0 loss to the Yankees. That's the schedule. That's the traditional score for a forfeit. It was kind of I think as Shirley Povich wrote, it was kind of like a part celebration, part funeral dirge. It was a sad sort of anti-celebration. And but I think most fans thought that there'd be a team here before too long. Just a funny postscript, or interesting postscript. Richard Nixon, a few weeks later, had a call with the Mayor of Washington, and was strategizing about getting a new team here. He thought the Indians or the White Sox might move here. And he thought, by 1976, for the bicentennial, we'll definitely have a new team in Washington. Obviously, he was off by many years. And I think it took baseball a lot longer than people thought for Washington to finally get another team.
Well, we even saw the San Diego Padres
Right.
supposed to move to Washington, and cards, the bubblegum cards showed players identified as playing for Washington, and we were all set to embrace them. We just wanted baseball back. Instead, 33 years. And there is a footnote that I like to cite in that Alex Bregman, an all-star third baseman, shortstop for Houston. His grandfather, Stanley Bregman, was Bob Short's lawyer when the club was moved by Short from Washington to Texas. And there are those of us who haven't forgiven Alex Bregman for his grandfather's activities.
You mentioned the 33-year wait, and it was 16 years ago this week, on April 4th, 2005, the Nationals played their first game, ending that 33-year Major League Baseball drought in Washington. And then on April 14th, 2005, they played their first home game at RFK Stadium. So now we can compare and contrast, talk about what it was like that night, and how you look back on that now. We talked about the last Senators game. Let's talk about that first Nationals game. Fred?
Yeah, I was at the home opener in 2005. I seem to recall Vinny Castilla had a really good game. They beat the Diamondbacks. I believe John McCain, who was an Arizona senator, so we're rooting for the Diamondbacks, so he was there. An electric night. I mean, it kind of almost had the playoff atmosphere. There was I talked about the pent up demand in that last game in 71. Well, you just fast forward to that, and it's pent up for 33 more years, and obviously different fans for the most part, but there are a few that were at that 71 game, I'm sure. And it was an exciting time. And the fact that they were able to start off with a victory was great. And it's funny, I don't know if folks remember this, but they were in first place, like into early July. Nobody saw it coming. They had been the Expos and they hadn't been very good. And they, if I'm not mistaken, they were 50-31 at the All-Star break, and then 31-50 after the All-Star break. They finished a 500 team. Their magic wore off, but 500 was actually pretty good for a new team here, and also very good by Washington baseball standards historically.
You can contrast that, if you will, with the expansion Senators, who were very good in their first season in 1971 until they were leading Boston 12-5 with 2 outs in the 9th inning, and they lost the game 13-12. And at that point, Washington's expansion ball club went south, and they finished last.
The Nationals' first manager was the late legendary Frank Robinson, who may have been the most well-known original National and arguably more popular than any of the original players. Talk about the impact of Frank Robinson on this new franchise. Fred?
Well, he did bring kind of winning mentality for sure. And I think that was one reason they got off to that really good start in 2005. He got the most out of his guys. He was a taskmaster. And as you say, he was really beloved by fans here. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the last game of the season, he came out, got a standing ovation. He had a lot to do with that strong start, although after that, they had a couple of bad seasons, unfortunately, which wasn't surprising. I mean, I don't think anybody thought that they were a 500 team. They had really played kind of above their pay grade that first year here.
Phil, thoughts on Frank Robinson? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was class, and that's what we needed when they brought a team into Washington. He was the right man at the right time.
We're going to go into that lightning round in a minute, but I do want to talk about presidents in the game first. President Dwight Eisenhower once told a story about a childhood day spent fishing with a buddy on a Kansas river. As we sat there in the warmth of the summer afternoon on a riverbank, he recalled, we talked about what we wanted to do when we grew up. Eisenhower told his friend he wanted to be a Major League Baseball player, a genuine professional like Honus Wagner. His friend said he'd like to be President of the United States. Neither of us got our wish, Eisenhower said. Eisenhower was a decent center fielder on his high school team, went on to play junior varsity at West Point, and Eisenhower did get to do what many presidents have done, throw out the first pitch at a major league game. Fred, talk about the history of presidential first pitches in Washington.
Yeah, and let me start with Eisenhower, actually. The first year he was president, he skipped the tradition to go golfing in Augusta. And it created a real scandal back in Washington because people thought that the president owed this. And luckily for Eisenhower, the game was rained out and he quickly hopped on a plane and threw out the first pitch and went back to golfing. But the tradition was very different than what we see now. So the Senators would start the season a day before the rest of the American League, and it was known as the presidential opener. And so all the attention was on Washington. Congress recessed for the day so they could see the president throughout the first ball. And he wouldn't throw it out from the mound like we used to sing now. We'd throw it from his box and the stands. And he'd throw it up for grabs for players for both sides. They would kind of jockey for it. And whoever would get it would get an autograph from the president. Actually, a funny story. White Sox player named Jim Rivera once got the ball that President Kennedy had thrown out. And he brought it over to Kennedy, and Kennedy quickly signed the ball. And Rivera said, do you think anybody will believe that this ball was signed by the president of the United States? You can't read that. No one, if I bring this on a bar on the south side of Chicago, no one's going to believe this. And he gave it back to Kennedy. Kennedy laughed the whole time, was a good sport, and signed it over again.
funny.
The presidential openers were a big thing in Washington, right through the expansion senators. And I think not only did we have the American League opener here in Washington, but there was also the National League opener, which was in Cincinnati.
Right.
And I think both of those occurred the day before the other clubs played. You couldn't do it now because Cincinnati and Washington are both in the National League. But
they can play each other, right?
Say again?
They could play each other.
Yeah. Where?
Yeah, that's a solution.
Where?
Alternate.
Okay. But I think there was a lot of, I don't want to say ill feelings, but disappointments when baseball did away with the presidential, the before the season presidential opener.
All right, let's move into this lightning round. I'll mention a name or a theme. We have about 9 minutes left, and we'll see how many of these we can get through. And then I have a final question for each of you. And if you could contain your answers to maybe 30 seconds, 40 seconds on these. Let's start with Walter Johnson. Fred, thoughts on Walter Johnson?
Just synonymous with Washington baseball. A really great person as well as a great pitcher, and the guy that really carried the 1924 team on his back and brought Washington his first World Series title.
Walter Johnson was beyond baseball. He lived here for the rest of his life, lived in Bethesda. And in fact, there's a school in Bethesda, Walter Johnson Senior High School. He ran for Congress in 1946, lost, but was a gentleman farmer until he passed away shortly thereafter.
Frank Howard. And Phil, why don't we start with you on Frank Howard?
Hondo, just the gentle giant. He was terrific. A sore-armed outfielder whom Eddie Brinkman used to go out midway in left field to get Howard's throws that came in, but a tremendous, tremendous home run hitter. And I think at one point he had home runs in 6 consecutive games, which I think that was a record at that time.
Very quick story on Frank Howard. When Ted Williams became manager, he worked on making him a more selective hitter. And so at the 1969 opening day, you had Richard Nixon and Bowie Kuhn sitting together behind home plate. And Bowie Kuhn tells Nixon, Ted Williams has worked on Frank Howard. He's making him a much more selective hitter. Just watch. And the first pitch comes, it bounces 6 feet in front of home plate, and Frank Howard swings and misses. And Nixon just shot Kuhn a look, and they both laughed. But actually, it was a small sample size because Howard did wind up increasing his walks and cutting down his strikeouts that year, with having great and still having a lot of home runs. So,
perfect segue because the next name is Ted Williams. Fred, why don't you start? Ted Williams.
Yeah, guy who really revitalized Washington baseball, if only for a year. Became manager, as I mentioned, in '69. The team had the worst record in baseball the year before. He got them to play 10 games over 500. And a lot of it was not so much great strategy because he wasn't a great strategist, but really getting the most out of his players and just being a colorful taskmaster that the players really related to, at least in that first year.
Phil?
Colorful, huh? There were lots of statements that Ted Williams made that we couldn't quote on this. He was larger than life.
Max Scherzer. Phil, you want to take that one first?
Certain Hall of Famer, right? That let's just hope that at the age 36, or is it 37, that he's going to have a 20-game, 20-win streak this year as well, along with Strasburg and I'm blanking on the Patrick Corbin. We're going to go all the way this year, no doubt about it.
Great. Fred? Max Scherzer?
Yeah, just a gamer. I mean, we all recall, he couldn't even really lift his arm in bed, couldn't turn his neck, and he was pretty much written off. In fact, this sort of segues to when the word came down that he had to miss game, I think it was his game 5 start in Washington. The wife of Ted Lerner made some comment to the effect of, you got to have heart, you got to just still have faith. And in fact, she was right. And Scherzer was proved that her faith was right to put her faith in him.
Next up, the Lerner family. Talk about the Lerner family. Fred?
Local roots and a lot of money. When they first bought the team, I wrote a piece arguing that those are the two things that had been missing in Washington, not all the way back from the Griffith era, but certainly the Bob Short era, who was really didn't have a lot of money, was overextended, and also was not from here. It's the fact that the Lerners, Ted Lerner grew up as a baseball fan in Washington, and remember he'd even gone to the 37 All-Star game here. That with all the billions of dollars is just something that hopefully will cement the team here for forever.
Phil?
I unbound admiration for the Lerners. But having said that, as I said earlier, they own the team, but the team belongs to the fans. The Lerners are terrific and have been ever since they acquired the ownership of the team.
And they have said that, what you just said, right down the road. They own the team, but the team belongs to the fans. Shirley Povich. Phil?
Shirley Povich, the dean of Washington sports writers, covered the Senators back in 24. Was prolific. Not only did he turn out columns on a regular basis, but they were so articulate. He's a Washington icon. And when they got around to creating the Washington Sports Hall of Fame, Shirley Povich was there in the first year.
Fred?
I'm going to paraphrase something he wrote in 71 when the Senators moved to Texas, and he said the only redeeming quality of this place they're moving to is, he called it some jerk town that is located halfway between Fort Worth and Dallas.
And last phrase, just give me your thoughts on this. First in war, first in peace, and last in the American League. Fred?
Well, we can rewrite it as first in war, first in peace, and first in the National League.
Phil?
Just respond to that by saying 2019.
There you go. Last questions for each of you. Phil, as you look back on your career, what stands out as most meaningful to you?
Well, I did 6 years with the Senators, 30 some years with the Redskins, Washington football team, many, many years of college sports. My greatest thrill in announcing was doing the Old Timers game in 1981, when I had the chance to introduce my great heroes. And literally, when I introduced Joe DiMaggio, I got chills down my spine. The Old Timers games played here were wonderful for me. Of course, the Washington Senators weren't too good, but the Old Timers games were great.
Thank you. Fred, in your acknowledgments, you offer a heartfelt thanks to your late parents for their inspiration of hard work, hustle, and creativity, as well as their love and support dating back to my childhood. To close it out, talk about your parents and how they spiritually contributed to this book.
Thank you for asking that. My father actually got me into writing books. We co-authored a couple of books, one on the Yankee-Red Sox rivalry, another one about oral history of baseball players growing up. And he had this incredible drive that I don't really have quite as much, but I try to channel as much as I can. Whenever I'm working on any project at all, I often will think about him and what he would do. And my mom, the same way. She was also an incredibly hard worker. Would motivate me to not watch TV as a kid and get off my butt and do other things. And the two of them just had this work ethic that I wouldn't be where I am today without them. So that's really the best way to describe their influence on me professionally.
Fred, you ought to, you're just being modest in talking about your father. How about the numbers of books that he wrote?
So my dad wrote, thanks, Phil, he wrote about 50 books, mostly on sports. And then he and my mom co-wrote about half a dozen oral histories, mostly centered around New York in one way or another. So about Broadway, about Brooklyn, Manhattan, the Catskills. They really had this sort of cottage industry of oral histories. They loved New York. They're both from Brooklyn. And as one New York Times reviewer described their book on Brooklyn, you could kind of, it's the vibe that kind of Brooklyn kind of seep through the pages. You could almost feel being in Brooklyn at the time. So yeah, that's a great point, Phil, and thank you for asking.
And that will be our last word today. The book is entitled You Gotta Have Heart, Washington Baseball from Walter Johnson to the 2019 World Series Champion Nationals. Author Fred Fromer and attorney Phil Hochberg. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
We're pleased to present each of you virtually with our National Press Club coffee mug. We will send these to you, along with our hope that you will join us again in person in the very near future. Thank you again, and great good luck. A quick word about two upcoming headliner events. On April 6th at 2 p.m., we will receive the latest updates on COVID-19 and the vaccine rollout from Dr. Anthony Fauci, a huge Washington Nationals baseball fan himself. And on April 12th at 2 p.m., Washington Post reporter John Woodrow Cox will discuss his book, Children Under Fire, which explores the impact of violence on children. We hope you'll join us for both of those. Our thanks to producer Lindsay Underwood, to our headliners co-leaders Donald Linewan-Loger and Lori Russo, today's headliner event coordinator Joe Luchuk, and to our terrific National Press Club team behind the scenes here in the Broadcast Operations Center. We thank our members and our guests for your questions and for joining us. Be well, stay safe, play ball, and have a good day.